But on the next panel, we've already referred to the scale-up questions. And how do you scale this up regulatory, educationally, decision support? And we have a great panel to opine there and to give us their wisdom. And in doing so, we have a wonderful moderator, David Shaywitz, MD, PhD, trained here at Harvard, who's been really a wonderful scientist, but has had experiences in clinical care, drug discovery, development, strategy, strategic planning, commercialization, genomics, digital health, and even a good stint in the venture capital. And he's now the founder and principal of Astounding Health Tech Advisory Services. He also is an amazing poster child for the efficacy, at least for him, of exercise plus a ketogenic diet. And so I hand it over to David. Thank you very much.
Great. All right, well, thank you, Zach. My name is David Shaywitz. I live in the Bay Area, but did all my medical and scientific training in Boston. It's now my privilege to be a lecturer in Zach's department. I spent most of my career as a drug and technology developer and more recently as an investor, serving as a senior partner at Takeda Ventures in Palo Alto. Currently, my day job is founder of Astounding Health Tech, my own advisory firm where I serve as a thought partner to senior R&D leaders trying to incorporate digital and data into the discovery, development, and deployment of impactful new medicines. As many of you know, this annual meeting is my absolute positively favorite because of the way the meeting, and by that I mean Zach, not only bring the most interesting science and technology, but also make it abundantly, palpably clear that these promising approaches and modalities are exciting and useful only to the degree they effectively serve the needs of the individual patients who are counting on them. This core humanity at the center of rigorous technology is what makes this meeting, Zach, and the department so special and unique. I'm especially excited to be here today moderating this panel focused on the paradoxical question of how to think about hyper-individualized treatment at scale. Fortunately, we're joined this morning by an exceptional group of experts, like Amy DuRoss, who can help us think through the operational challenges, Bapu, who will offer a view into the economics, Arnaub, who will talk about the data management challenges, and our second Amy Abernethy, who will focus on the role of regulators. The speakers will each introduce themselves, so let's start with Amy DuRoss.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It's an honor to be here, although I wish we could be together in person. My name is Amy DuRoss. I am a co-founder and the CEO of Vineti, an enterprise software orchestration platform for personalized medicine. My background ranges from policy. I got my start as a patient advocate, testifying early and often before Congress as a young child growing up inside the Beltway. Then as a co-author and the executive director of California's $3 billion stem cell research initiative, which established the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or affectionately known as CIRM, a venture investor at GE, and now a co-founder and CEO of Vineti. Great, so Vineti, just a quick introduction of our company. Vineti was created really from a conversation among Novartis, the Mayo Clinic, and General Electric. We established the company 4 years ago to provide a new solution for a new set of problems, really the most complex supply chain and logistics workflow requirements in the history of medicine. The problem statement was, put more simply, how do you scale out mass customization? How do you move from the Model T to the assembly line? So our global scale enterprise software company really provides the connective tissue that ensures automated chain of identity, chain of custody, and chain of condition to ensure that the right patient receives the right therapy at the right time. We are fully in conformance with all the regulatory standards. Our system, or a system like it, is required for commercialization of cellular therapies and many gene-modified therapies. We are, if you really focus here on the sort of blue chevrons in the middle, this is the Vineti system. These are all of the end-to-end key process steps in production and delivery for highly personalized therapies. And then what you see on the outer concentric circle are all the other systems of record, EHR, LIMS, ERP, MES, depending on where the product is in its life cycle we're supporting it. We support products from even just sort of post IND all the way through commercial phase. And so really Vineti provides this essentially railroad and connective tissue among many different systems, and really offers a source of truth for therapeutic manufacturers and all of their interdependent partners and stakeholders who are required to drive single batch therapies or devices and procedures. We're also a big part of our value proposition, why it was so exciting to be invited to join this discussion today, is to both create and promulgate standards. So when our founding group got together to really set forth on creating an independent agnostic platform, we acknowledged that the only way to scale out such complexity in workflows and also understanding the science is iterating really in excess of Moore's law under the hood. So this dynamism and flexibility was only going to continue. Was to create as much process standard along the entire chain, both the supply chain and the value chain, as possible. So we spend our time not just working with our customers and trying to conform standards wherever we can to ease the burden on the clinical centers, particularly the clinical centers of excellence who are first implicated in this new modality of therapeutics. But we also sit on the SCB, the FDA-funded standard setting body, and we host a internal supply chain and manufacturing council.
1 minute.
Even for partners who may not be fully customized onto the platform. But the idea behind the system is to provide a railroad of industrialization. So the opportunity, again, to find conformance wherever we can so that we can industrialize and then optimize this remarkable therapeutic area. That's the only way we're actually going to reduce cost. We're going to increase access. So there's a fundamental belief behind the company that if you can put the smart plumbing in place, then you really can hasten true access to patients. Thank you. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Awesome. Bapu?
Thank you, David. So I was asked or tasked to talk about how to think about the value of highly personalized therapies and to think about pricing, so I prepared remarks on a simpler question is, what is the meaning of life? Actually, I have no thoughts on that. But so let me first start with some high level thoughts on how we think about value in economics and why healthcare is obviously very different. We don't have whole disciplines that are designed to attach or estimate the value of products that we consume, like water bottles or houses or cars. We kind of rely on the market and individual decisions to help guide what people value things at. For example, if a water bottle was priced at $25, most people wouldn't buy that water bottle unless it was a really hot day and they were dying of thirst. And the price ultimately falls down to a level that is more commensurate with the value that the water bottle offers. So we are in healthcare doing something different, in part because we don't have a market that operates in quite the same way as we have a market for houses or cars. Insurance dictates that the prices that individuals pay for drugs or new technologies isn't always the same as the price that the health plan might pay because of insurance. And so as a result, we've gotten into this business of trying to estimate what the value is that new technologies bring. Now, that is really difficult when we're thinking about therapies that are highly individualized, that as a result of being highly individualized are much costlier to produce than a therapy that might be produced in a large vat for large swaths of the population. The additional challenge is how do you attach a price or value on something that is fundamentally critical to someone's life? That's difficult to do. Nonetheless, economists have tried to take on that challenge and have devised tools to try to estimate what people are willing to pay for improvements in either the longevity of their life or in the quality of life. And And that would by itself probably be a whole webinar, but suffice it to say, economists have tried to devise tools to try to estimate what people are willing to pay for a quality adjusted life year, a year of life that is modified to some extent by what is the quality of that life. I want to spend the next few moments taking an extension beyond that way of thinking and say, well, what is it that's so complicated about valuing highly specialized therapies that makes that sort of exercise different than the exercise that we already have in place to try to measure the value of statin drugs or the value of putting a stent in someone's heart? So I want to focus on three ideas. The first is something called the insurance value of medical innovation. The idea is the following. If someone owns a house and that house burns down, most people are unable to fork over several $100,000 to rebuild that house immediately. And what they instead have is an insurance policy against their house burning down. And the interesting thing about that insurance policy is that it offers benefit to individuals whose house never burns down. So most of us are lucky to have a home that remains erect and it never burns. And nonetheless, we all have fire insurance, and we derive benefit from that fire insurance for the unlikely event that the house burns down. The same logic actually applies to therapies that affect small swaths of the population, for which rare disease therapies and specialized therapies, I think, are becoming increasingly more common. There is a value to individuals who never even purchase the therapy, who never even have the disease, who never need to take the treatment, to having that treatment available. And it comes through this insurance that we as individuals have against the possibility that we or loved ones will have a disease and will have a therapy available to treat that. Now, this idea of insurance value, for those of you who are familiar with the quality adjusted life year and the value that economists or policymakers would sometimes place on an additional year of life to help guide the valuation and pricing of new therapies, to put it in perspective, the insurance value of medical innovation is probably around 10% of that value. So it's not small. So to put it differently, there's value that comes to us that is meaningful from therapies that we hopefully will never have to use. The second idea is what sometimes is referred to as the spillover value of new medical innovation. And so the idea is that if you have a rare disease that affects someone and you have a personalized therapy for them, they are not the only recipient of that therapy, and they're not the only recipient of better health and better health outcomes that come from that treatment. If they have family members who have to take time off from work to be caregivers, if they have differences in the interactions with society, with families, with employers that result from having better health, that's obviously valuable, not just to the person who's affected by the disease, but it's also valuable to others who share relationships with that person. And that's not to say that we should use that spillover value, that additional value that accrues to others besides someone who's affected by the disease, as a justification for higher drug prices writ large. It is to say that as we're thinking about where to invest our dollars, our public dollars, whether into schools, education, defense, roads, the NIH, we should be measuring the value that new things bring to society in a way that's rigorous and in a way that's accurate. And so as I think about therapies that are highly personalized, that bring spillover effects, not just to the people who are affected by the disease, I want to think about measuring those specific attributes in a way that is accurate. The last thing I'll say is an idea which is relatively recent, and that is the idea of option value. So I'll start with an example of an individual who had HIV in the mid-1980s. And at that point in time, there was a drug called AZT, which was modestly effective, had side effects, but for people who were affected with HIV, it was nonetheless the only treatment option available. About 10 years later, slightly less than 10 years later, there were a new set of therapies that came on the market that were much more effective and had better side effect profiles. Now, the first drug, AZT, actually introduced something called an option value. It gave some people who were lucky enough to live long enough for better therapies that additional life that they needed to just live long enough to get those second therapies. And so even though AZT, as measured by the increment in additional life that it brought individuals, would be valuable to those individuals who took the drug, there is still this additional value that we call an option value, very much like a financial instrument called an option, that allowed people to live long enough to get a better, more definitive therapy. So as we're thinking about pricing technologies that are in this space that is rapidly developing, where more and more personalized therapies are introduced into specific diseases, we want to think about the value that a therapy brings as also being the value that it offers to individuals who are able to live long enough to a better treatment occurs. The last point I'll say is, why do we talk about value in healthcare? Why does it matter? I alluded to this in part because we have to think about where to allocate not just scarce healthcare resources, but where to invest public and private dollars. The other thing that is important to realize is that healthcare is a highly research and development intensive industry. When we have a water bottle on a hot day, we don't expect that water bottle to cost $10, because if it did, even though it's highly valuable to me on a hot day, someone will be coming out there, another vendor, another seller would say, well, I'll sell it for $6. And then another seller would say, I'd sell it for $4. And the price would be competed down to the point of almost the cost of production. And in general, that's what we want for society. That's what competitive markets do. They lower the price of products to the point where they're close to the cost of production. And that leaves all the people who have a valuation of that product more than the cost able to purchase it. And we tend to encourage that in society. For healthcare technologies, it's different. And the reasons it's different is because we have to give innovators an incentive to develop technologies in the first place. And so that's why we typically have patents or other forms of regulatory exclusivity to encourage the innovation in products. And we allow the manufacturers to capture some of that value that they otherwise would not be able to when products become generic and we get down to more of the water bottle pricing model. So I'll stop there. I'm probably not at 5 minutes, but I'll leave some time for others. But I'm happy to take questions as they arise later.
All right. Well, Bapu, thank you. One other quick thing. So you always precocious. We initially intended to have this just be a quick intro and then sort of get to some of the questions later. You elegantly integrated both of those things. So maybe we can go back to Bapu just for a moment, just so you can say where you are and what you do.
Where I am, I'm in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Sorry, I forgot the introduction. I'm an economist. I'm a physician, a professor at Harvard Medical School. I spend most of my time working on big data projects that use what we call natural experiments, studying, for example, whether outcomes of individuals who have heart attacks or cardiac arrest on the day of a major cardiology meeting are worse or better. It turns out they're actually better if you have a heart attack, and the reason why we think is because a lot of the cardiologists are out of town, and the care that you receive is different. So I spend most of my time working on those sorts of interesting big data exercises at the intersection of healthcare and economics. And I spend some amount of time also thinking about issues related to the economics of medical innovation, how to value and price new technologies, which are more in line with the comments I just offered today.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you so much again. So just on the introduction, Arnaub, do you want to just do a brief intro of yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And thanks to DBMI for the opportunity to speak at this conference. So my name is Arnaub Chatterjee, and the perspective I'd like to share today is from a company that sits squarely in the middle of the pharmaceutical world and is aiming to be an enabler of data science to bring hyper-individualized therapies to patients and to the market. So in Medidata, I oversee product strategy and our go-to-market across data science products, which includes evidence generation and omics and imaging. In previous lives, I was at McKinsey. I led a lot of our work in pharma data and analytics. And then I was at Merck for some time working in outcomes research and data science, and then come from a previous presidential administration back in the day when Obama was around and working on at HHS on data science and health technology platforms. So if you will allow me to share my slides here, see if this works. Great. So what I want to talk about is, kind of what are we seeing in terms of what scale up means from the lens of a data science technology company, and just kind of 2 seconds on where we sit in the world. So, Medidata is a 20-year-old electronic data capture company. Currently manages more than 50% of the world's clinical trial data that's run on a digital platform. And Acorn was born about 18 months ago as Medidata's data sciences entity. So when we talk about data, what we're talking about is this historical clinical trial data set that we manage on behalf of our pharmaceutical sponsors and academic institutions. It's about 6.3 million patients and 22,000 trials. And the vision here is to create like a better way to understand how patients think about how they perform in and out of experimental therapies if you compare clinical trial data to the real world, and how does that actually better enhance the way we think about clinical trials. So in the handful of minutes that I have, I want to talk about two things. One of them is how does it work for a data science company today to power the development of precision therapies? And then the second thing I want to do is actually take an example of data science in action that could have a massive impact on hyper-individualized treatments if it actually were to scale up. And I'll kind of talk through some of the living experiences we've had around that. So I think it's important to do a bit of a post-mortem. We're sort of many years into data science journeys within the biopharma world. And if you kind of go back to the core essence of what we're trying to solve for, the sources of failure and what plagues, R&D product teams are pretty much the same. So from a design perspective, clinically, trials may continue to demonstrate failures in how they define and demonstrate efficacy. There might be safety issues. We have problems with operational design as it relates to patient recruitment and enrollment and retention. And sometimes you just bet on the wrong biological hypothesis. So as we look at like the measurement increment here, how has data science scaled up and how has it meaningfully moved the needle against what are age-old pharmaceutical problems? And what do we do to industrialize solutions? So kind of on the forward progress side, on the positives, if we look at some of the biggest pharma companies, Novartis, Janssen, they've built out established data science teams. These are highly talented mixes of people that incorporate computational biology and machine learning and informatics. There are many cases where they're kind of centrally located within the pharmaceutical company. They have chief data science officers, as they do in the case of Janssen. And they're really trying to aim to centralize data sourcing and purchasing. Biotechs have also kind of followed suit, and they're building entire platforms for drug discovery that are built upon machine learning. So these are certainly like ways to look at the needle moving forward. I also think this notion of AI and data science enabled drug discovery has also made some meaningful strides. The company BenchSci reported, and I think they actually stopped counting, but as of their last count, there are about 230 companies that are using AI in life sciences in some way. And there have been some meaningful achievements, from companies like Recursion and Exscientia and Schrödinger and Atomwise. So we need to acknowledge that this is a long process and it's a long road, but there has been movement. And I think the last thing on the positive is that there has been a continuous major appetite for how do we think about novel data sources. On the countervailing side, there's still this definition of what value is. So as we think about how these companies scale, we're still waiting for the home runs and how you show meaningful value. Data centralization doesn't necessarily mean that it's centralized data. There's a disconnect between clinical development and data science, as opposed to how do you think about the back and forth between questions and hypothesis testing and where data might fit. And then, to paraphrase Bruce Booth and Andreessen Horowitz, if software is eating the world, then biology is absolutely consuming software. And I think in many cases, culture then consumes the biology. So we're sort of seeing a perpetual cycle in terms of how these forces kind of go against each other. And I think the last thing I want to share is, of a data science project and methodology that really gets to the heart of precision medicine, where if you take something like synthetic controls, where you're taking patient level data from a large indication and you're carefully selecting historical patients who are meeting these key eligibility criteria, you could basically change the way you think about using data to replace or augment the control arm of a trial, and it saves years of enrollment and recruitment time. This is huge in single arm trials, it's huge in rare indications, and even during COVID, where patient enrollment has taken a beating for certain trials. So you're seeing the slides here, there's a number of examples where this has worked, whether it's been at Flatiron or whether you've seen the home runs for trying to get access to breakthrough therapy designation. What I want to say is, if this is such a silver bullet, how do we scale this up? And we can have a discussion about this, but the things that I'm taking away for how do we kind of scale this is, one, you have to make data auditable and traceable and qualified and still build that trust. The second thing is methodology. Before we jump to AI and machine learning, the biostats here has to check out, and we're seeing kind of an example of how do we crawl, walk, and run. And then there are questions around risk modeling, being part of the ride that pharma companies and biotechs go on with regards to milestones. And that gets into how do we define value in terms of what we demonstrate early on as a data science tech company versus what are we doing on behalf of our clients to create those therapies. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Amy.
Terrific. With that, Amy Abernethy, introduction and a little bit about all the many different things that you do and how all the many different ways you're thinking about this emerging and exciting space that you've played such a large role in defining.
Thank you. So first of all, I'm honored to be here with everyone today. And this for me is a really meaningful topic. I am an oncologist by background, and really my motivating North Star has been my entire career. How do I take better care of this person sitting in front of me? It's the hyper-individualized, personalized medicine question that scales to all the people that sit in front of us and from the clinic, in the clinic that we're trying to solve for. I have had what feels like now multiple careers. So I was an academic and a professor of medicine at Duke, where I ran the Center for Learning Healthcare, and we were trying to figure out how do we build data platforms and ways to continuously learn and take better and better care of patients. That then translated to my next career, where I was the Chief Medical and Chief Scientific Officer at Flatiron Health, and also was responsible for thinking about how do we develop a lot of the methods that you just heard about with respect to using real-world data for a number of regulatory and scientific purposes. And then most recently have come to the Food and Drug Administration, where I have two roles. I'm both Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA, as well as the Acting Chief Information Officer. And as we get into this topic of scaling hyper-individualized therapies, we're going to talk about from the regulatory side in a moment, but I thought I would mention one other thing as it relates to my background that also comes along with this issue of scaling as a regulator and from an FDA perspective. I got to the FDA where I thought my three areas of focus were going to be patient centricity, real world data, and personalized medicine, and discovered, wait a second, in order for the FDA to scale and to meet those needs, the FDA itself has to be as efficient and scaled as possible in order to do our work and be able to make sure that innovation continues to happen and we're able to regulate the products that came out. And as a result, I actually stepped back, took on the additional role of acting CIO. We announced the Technology Modernization Action Plan in September, where we're focused on making sure that we have a modern cloud-forward infrastructure at the FDA, as well as modern use of data, and in order to allow us to scale our work inside of FDA. That matters because as we think about these hyper-individualized therapies, we need to make sure that not only do we have the scientific expertise to evaluate and regulate those therapies and work in concert with industry and with all of you, we also have to make sure that we are working as efficiently as possible, because there's going to be a lot of regulatory work that goes along with this. And so a key part of the technology modernization efforts at FDA are about allowing FDA regulators to do the mission critical work from a regulatory perspective and reduce the sort of day-to-day grunt work that doesn't need to be done by using technology. Everything from bots to artificial intelligence to just modern data streams. And so that's been a key focus at FDA. The other thing that I would point to is what Amy Dross highlighted earlier, where on the right-hand corner of her slide, she mentioned that we already have over 900 INDs for cell and gene therapies, and we expect to be approving somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 cell and gene therapies a year in the next several years. If you think about that, we're going to need to be working fast. And also, as we think about the fact that these kind of approvals are often going to come with long periods of follow-up after the initial approval, we're not only going to need to work fast for a rapidly expanding book of work, but we're going to need to keep that evidence development and diligent regulatory activity going on for a long time. And so as FDA, we need to be ready along with you. And so I think that's one other aspect of scaling that's going to be quite important for our future. I'll stop there.
Terrific. Always such a pleasure, Amy. We will take audience questions, so please contribute them by Slido shortly. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of points, starting with Amy DuRoss. So if I was to sort of summarize what I'm just hearing from today's experts, from Amy DuRoss's talk, it was the value of standards. From Bapu was talking about sort of the spillover effect, that when you're developing, he talked about many things. One of them was when you have a new technology, it isn't just the impact on the individual affected, but sort of the broader community, the caregivers, and broader community that's affected. From Arnaub, I heard a lot about trust, and I think all of those topics probably are core to what Amy was saying, but as well as the idea of needing a modern infrastructure. For Amy DuRoss, could you talk a little bit about standards and to what extent they are, how everyone seems to agree that there are so many different areas of technology where if one could agree on standards, there'd be so much acceleration. And yet it seems instances where people collectively agree on that in healthcare feel more the exception than the rule. How has that been going in the course of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so there's so many different levels of standardization that are required in parallel. We deal with everything from sort of data standards or the analytics on the analytics side to far more rudimentary and frankly mundane pieces that are just as important, certainly for patient safety, such as label conventions. So many of these hyper-individualized therapies, as most of you know, often cross borders. There are different requirements for labels in different geographies, even in the same continent. So again, that just introduces unnecessary risk and opportunity for error. These are, I think there's, we're such in the early innings of at least the commercial phase. There's tremendous activity, as Amy mentioned, on the clinical side, but just when we get to true scale out is when we achieve commercialalization. And
Amy, one of the things to your point that I thought was interesting was last year at this National Cancer Meeting, when people were talking, obviously everyone was so excited, for example, all these hyper-individualized treatments in the context of oncology, right? But it was all of the regulatory requirements at the hospital. There was a physician scientist from the Brigham, I think, who was describing just being massively overwhelmed, just to your point, by the paperwork, by how every regulatory, not Amy, but regulatory authority in the hospital, at this society, at that society, had their own little things. And it seemed like the paperwork was going to kill the innovation more than the actual science.
Yeah,
is that part of what you're responding to?
Absolutely. The infrastructure is struggling to keep up with the pace of discovery. And so, the massive efforts like at FDA to really upgrade the underlying infrastructure are so important, or we won't be able to really take advantage of this remarkable science. I think there is room for optimism here. I think there's a increasing focus, at least in our industry, around sort of what's the low-hanging fruit, particularly with regard to the supply chain, where there have been so many challenges. Let's take down a few key standards that we can all agree on across the ecosystem and start to promulgate them. I think that will then build the momentum to tackle the more difficult. Frankly, the data analytics side, there's a lot, as we see in other sectors of medicine, there's a lot of divergence of opinion as to what the right set of standards should be, especially when you're dealing with high value therapies. To Bapu's points, the economics of these therapies drive a set of bizarre behavior in our industry, unfortunately. So I think we're getting some progress. I think it's just start with where we can identify convergence and then really build upon that momentum. That's certainly what our company and our group of partners is seeking to effect. Yeah.
Arnaub, let me have you comment briefly on the issue of standards and trust and how you're thinking about it as you think about the challenges of moving from individual therapies to scaling them. And then maybe Amy can comment on this. Amy Abernethy can comment on this as well. Why don't we start with you, Arnaub?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's maybe two sides to it. So, how do you sort of create an apples to apples way to look at data And are you adhering to what is sort of an industry accepted or academically accepted standard for the way you think about data conversion? Which doesn't sound like a particularly sexy topic, but as you think about this through the lens of like an actual regulatory submission or how you're packaging and presenting that information, it actually matters a lot, you know? So as the industry starts to think about getting towards SDTM formats and OMOP models and all these things that tie into clinical and real world, there has to be sort of a way for us to all find alignment on, you know, what is the quote unquote acceptable way to submit. And we struggle and think a lot about that, you know, in terms of what does it mean to standardize data at scale and how do you create fidelity within the data? You know, because at the end of it, I think what we're trying to do is come up with a way that can validate the fact that we're pulling data from multiple streams, from different sources, from different parts of the world, and they certainly don't speak to each other. This is a problem that plagues not only healthcare, but all of technology. So how are we kind of accepting that there is a commonly regarded way of doing this? And I think that's sort of the problem that every organization is going through right now.
And Amy, the Tower of Babel challenge, how are you proposing to solve it?
Well, you know, so I'm going to agree with what we've just said and add an additional piece here. So that as we think about standards that support industrialization, kind of full stack industrialization, as Amy has talked about, and then we just heard about standards as it relates to data standards and thinking about, for example, interoperability, transmission standards, etc. There's another type of standard that I've learned about since I've joined FDA in the last year, which is essentially regulatory frameworks that in themselves act as an additional kind of standard. And I think in this space of hyper-individualized therapies, if we look, for example, at the case of Mila presented in the New England Journal back in October, and we think about the editorial that was written by Janet Woodcock and Peter Marks that went along with that case, they actually proposed, here are the things that we're going to worry about. A systematic framework that gives you the checklist that then starts to set up the framework for the standard. We'll look at it from a regulatory lens. So they asked, you know, what do we know in the hyper-individualized therapy space for this particular therapy as it relates to safety? What do we know about biological plausibility, dosing, manufacturing purity? They also said that one of the elements of making the regulatory decision is going to be about urgency, and they mentioned ethics. But also, how are we going to determine whether or not this intervention is efficacious? So in the particular case of Mila having prior history of understanding her seizure experience and whether or not the new intervention, now modified seizures, was important, and then what are the stopping rules? And so they actually laid out a framework, which is an additional kind of standard, and frameworks allow us to scale from a regulatory perspective because allows us to now communicate across industry, here's what the thinking is. And then that starts to translate to guidances in other ways so you can see it. So I think that in order to push this whole field forward with scale, you need essentially connecting and transmissions, but you also need ways of thinking about how you're going to monitor outcomes to make sure that it's working as expected.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Amy, everybody. I think Zak may have some audience questions. I'm going to turn the questions over to Zak.
Thank you very much. I'm reminded, by the way, of how frustrating it is on the one hand to have a medium like Zoom where you don't want to actually spend too much time because it's video. And on the other hand, the tension between that and the audience where we have such fine individuals who can give us so much insight and have so little time. So in that spirit, let me tell you that we're going to use our Slido interface to have you ask questions. And while you're thinking of questions, which by the way are beginning to pile up through Slido, while their questions are asked, we're going to exercise your Slido mechanical abilities by first giving you the trivia and then the quiz. So Rachel, could you first pull up the trivia question? All righty, let's, I'm very pleased that I spoofed you with my fake name, Fidatelio, for which I will make billions. Anyway, now it's going. All right, never mind. Okay, let's now go to the actual quiz. Well, I hope you all had nice SAT stress flashbacks for which you can thank me. We now go to the question part of it. All right, let's see. A lot of choices here. Sure. What about the value of rare disease research as a way to develop understanding and new tools that could be, what the hell? Sorry. That could be then applied to common diseases. Is that a perceived part of value? So the question is, can we use rare disease individualized therapies to inform common disease therapies? I would welcome an answer by Amy. You want to take an answer? Does the FDA, or is that beyond the FDA to start? It's not the FDA's role to start thinking, well, can this rare disease therapy apply to a common disease?
Yeah. So from the perspective of defining value from an FDA perspective, we really think about the individual medical product and its approval, and not think about it from a rare versus rare disease versus large disease perspective either. I think that the one thing that I will say is the rare disease space teaches us a lot about also more common diseases, and so there is great value in learning in the rare disease space and then applying that across. But from the standpoint of dollar value, I need to let Bapu answer that one.
All right, I have a question here for Bapu. Data scale and correctness is only a part. As long as health insurance companies can profit by selective pricing and exclusion, patients risk loss of care by sharing information, like familial DNA. And what concrete efforts do you think we should take to get basically social protection? And it seems to me, let's see, for health insurance, Jena should actually be protecting, there's legislation that should protect your health insurance from any discriminatory pricing. I'm not sure that's true yet of life insurance. Bapu, anything to comment on that?
Not specifically. I mean, I would say that this is an area where I think regulation is obviously is critical. I will say that there is one thing that we have observed with insurance companies and rare disease treatments. There, often what we see is that certain treatments are not covered. It's less so now, but they're either not covered or they're placed on higher cost sharing tiers, in part because insurance companies have historically used their benefit design to try to attract and not attract certain types of enrollees who may have higher costs. So when we think about therapies like CAR T and other more advanced, sophisticated, expensive therapies, this is what I'd have in the back of my mind: is what are the things that insurance companies what strategies might they employ to try to not attract these types of enrollees, which is something obviously from a public policy perspective we want to kind of watch out for.
So because of the brutality of this medium, we have to end this session now. And for that, I apologize.